Greetings, fellow thinkers and drinkers, and welcome to our continued look at the solo career of Tony Martin. In the first video, I was less than enthusiastic about his initial effort Back Where I Belong. I was very unenthusiastic about it, if we're being honest. Well, 17 years even elapsed until we get his second solo album, Scream, which was released in 2005. This, as 17 years after Back Where I Belong, came approximately 10 years after he ultimately, finally parted ways with Black Sabbath. The intervening years, he's associated himself with a variety of projects, the Guccini, the Cage with Dario Molo, Empire, Rondinelli, M5, amongst others. Some of which, may well feature in another video. On this occasion, it was very different to Back Where I Belong, which featured a plethora of special guests. Despite which, I have to say, it is a criticism I forgot to make in the previous video, that despite these big names featuring on Back Where I Belong, there was not a noticeable guitar solo, drum track, or instrumental performance of note. On this occasion, however, Tony Martin is effectively playing everything himself. This is a real solo effort. Exceptions to this are Cozy Pal on one track. I'll get to that once we start the review of the album. The ever-present Geoff Nicholls providing keyboards. And Joe Harford, who is Tony Martin's son, providing the guitars, which leaves the man himself playing drums, bass, some additional guitars, singing, and even providing the violin. As I said, this is a real solo effort. It kind of reminds one of the Woody Allen films, doesn't it? He wrote, produced, directed, and starred in. Speaking of producing, this is again, Tony Martin has assumed the responsibility and also produced the album, which was released on the 21st of November even, in 2005 in the UK at least according to Wikipedia. Sadly, released to little fanfare, and as far as I've been able to ascertain, did not exactly set the world on fire when it came to sales. However, it did meet with considerable critical acclaim. So what had changed? Well, his name obviously meant enough in the industry for him to get a solo deal, and I think maintain artistic control over it, something I took the liberty of perhaps doubting when I was reviewing Back Where I Belong. Times change. But he said he'd been out of the mainstream spotlight, for 10 years by now. Those collaborations and guest appearances and things he'd been on, again, not jumping the gun, we'll get to that, but might be of admirable quality, but they were not resulting in headlining tours or million sellers. But nevertheless, here we are. So what do we actually get on this occasion? Well, the album opens with Raising Hell. It's a thunderous opener, it really is. And it immediately recalls his halcyon days, shall we say, with Black Sabbath, namely Headless Cross and Tear. The drum track was provided by the late Cozy Pal. He recorded, apparently, a number of drum tracks, and he gave them to Tony Martin and said, look, if you ever feel like doing something with this, please do. And don't know when it was recorded, but since Cozy Pal died in 1998, it was obviously prior to that. And it gives it a little bit of gravitas. Yeah, it is unmistakably somehow Cozy Pal. Track is heavy. It's very deliberate, I think, and it's really full of drive. The guitar's general riffing is classic British metal. This is a mid-tempo offering. It's chunky but it's bursting with attitude. I like it, and Martin's voice soars, and it with that familiar mix of authority and melody. Yeah, this is a great statement of intent from the outset. This is not a nostalgia song either. It may have those familiar aspects or facets to it, but no, this is new music, and you can tell. I suppose you could say it's perhaps true of the whole album, but this is a very good example of what traditional metal can sound like when it is done well and with conviction. Okay, the second track is Bittersweet. Love this. This is darkly melodic, and lyrically even, I think, introspective. Allows Tony Martin to give a much more nuanced vocal performance on this. Musically, I think I seem to detect minor key guitar lines but yeah, it's got a smooth but still a menacing tone to it. Sounds really good. Yeah, and the chorus expands to some nice rich harmonies. There's emotional tension here, both lyrically and musically. There's bittersweet, hence the title perhaps, pulled between the aggression, shall we say, and melancholy, which I think shows his ability, it's not just as a singer, but as a songwriter, to bring dramatic flair to his work without lapsing into cliché. Next up is Faith in Madness. Standout track? Yes, most definitely. It's energetic, it's hook-laden, fuses a melodic sensibility with very sharp, very pronounced rhythmic control. Good, solid riffing on this, very purposeful, very dynamic, very driving. Chorus is, it is close. It's an arena rock type of chorus, I have to say. Nothing here, though, would have me thinking of Back Where I Belong or anything like that. But you have to admit it is what it is. It's a strong arena rock type chorus. Lyrically, I guess he's talking about belief and chaos, suggesting the underlying struggle of maintaining reason in an unhinged world. A theme not uncommon to him. Next song is I'm Gonna Live Forever. This has got a lot of swagger to it, a lot of groove to it. And it injects a shot of vitality midway through the record. So it's not commercial, but it's quirky. There is a bluesy undercurrent to it, perhaps in the guitars, the chord progressions. I don't know. At least I sense it. But it's a very forceful and defiant vocal, screaming self-belief and confidence. Something playfully self-referential about the lyrics. A veteran musician declaring his resilience, but with his tongue just a little bit in cheek. It's good stuff. Okay, Scream is the title track, slows the pace slightly and introduces a much darker, more theatrical tone. Arrangement builds a very brooding verse, very doomy, very Sabbathy this, to a powerful, almost cinematic chorus. Great vocals from Martin here, he alternates between the restrained tension and gives a full theatrical release on the chorus. Again, this is really strong stuff. It really is. And oh yes, before I forget, this features a violin solo. Okay, Surely Love Is Dead is up next. Slows things down a bit. It's very moody, very reflective composition. Very definite gothic undertones. Very clean guitar sounding, very atmospheric keys from Geoff Nicholls, and almost lamenting vocal from Tony Martin. broadens the palette of the album, I think. Interjects, as I just referred to, a nice change of pace. This is very, it's been fairly full on thus far, but this much more introspective effort. Nice chorus, resigned tone to it. It's haunting rather than heavy, but it's very, very effective. Okay, the kids of today don't understand the blues. Okay, maybe not the best title ever. And it's a bit sardonic in the lyrics, I think. But it's a good rocker, and there's humor in it. He's not taking this too literally or too seriously. He's poking fun at modern music culture, and why not? Musically, it's tight, it's punchy. Very good guitaring on this. Young Martin here, or Joe Harford to give him his real name, certainly knows his stuff. He's very impressive on this thus far. It's fun, it's witty, it's a strong track. Wherever You Go is another more melodic effort. You'd probably say this is the most radio-friendly song on the record, at least thus far. But it tempers its. There are heavier passages, but it tempers it with a warmth. The melody feels very natural, and Tony Martin's vocal delivery's phrasing here is particularly effective. Certainly the most accessible track on the album. But again, it just highlights, to me at least, his strength as a songwriter, and most certainly as a vocalist. Okay, the album itself closes out in epic style, The Field of Lies. And it returns to the grand atmospheric style fans associate with his best work. Think Nightwing, think When Death Calls, think the Sabbath Stones, Anno Mundi. It has that doomy, deliberate tempo to it. The riffs are mighty and weighty, and the vocals are commanding. Lyrically, again, it's a reflective thing: truth, deception, survival, things that, yes, I suppose they're quite common. And at least Tony Martin has often gone back to these sort of themes, but he does them so very well. Yeah, it's the longest song on the album, and this is, again, very, very Sabbath-esque. Would not have been out of place on Headless Cross. And to me, it's an absolute classic. Now, my version has a bonus track called Unbearable. I believe it was the Japanese bonus track. And it is a curious little addition indeed. On the verses and the chorus, this one flirts with hip-hop style rhythms. A phrase I never expected, or wished for that matter, to use when discussing any of Tony Martin's music. It's quite groovy. The vocals are spoken in part as is befitting that type of music, or at least so I'm told, for normally anything approaching hip-hop was the type of music I would take considerable pains to avoid having to listen to. But the lighter half of the track really rescues it, if that indeed is the right expression. Some great instrument, when we're back into the rock, the metal, and some great instrumental closeout to this song, and some really, really great guitar work from Joe Harford. And that was that. This is everything that Back Where I Belong was not. It has focus, it has cohesion, and what is more, it is fucking brilliant. As well as, I have to say, being wonderfully atmospheric. Yes, it does echo Black Sabbath. It really does. And it would not have disgraced as a Black Sabbath release. It most certainly would not. I have to say, I do prefer this to Cross Purposes and Forbidden. Although I must say both of those, especially the latter, have undergone something, a critical reappraisal in my world since the remaster and remix of last year. But, to one side now, this is really, really strong stuff. There's no filler on here. There's no song to skip on here, which I'm afraid those last two had a few of. And this has much more enthusiasm to it. It has much more drive to it. There's almost you can sense more enjoyment was put into the creation of this than I have to say, at least I get from those last two Sabbath albums. And I will go further. I would say this is better than Dio's last couple of efforts with Master of the Moon and the other one. That's certainly better than Magica. Oh, God. And it's certainly vastly superior to the corporate crap Ozzy Osbourne was pumping out at the time. What was it? Black Rain, I think, was roughly contemporary to this. I also prefer it to The Devil You Know, and I most certainly prefer it to the quite dire 13. So enough of the Sabbath comparisons. So it did not set the world alight in terms of sales, although, as I mentioned earlier, it was critically very well received. It would seem also that production is another string to Mr. Martin's bow, another talent here. I can't remember who produced Back Where I Belong, but these are worlds apart. And considering it was effectively recorded by Martin, his son, Geoff Nicholls, it sounds, and produced by them, I guess, as well. It sounds surprisingly full-blooded. The production is crisp, it's weighty, and it's got enough grit to keep it grounded, but enough polish, I would say, to showcase the very real strengths of the material. The Limp Dick production, which was one of the many downsides of Back Where I Belong, is thankfully completely missing here. The performances, again, effectively the three of them, but the performances here feel tight and purposeful, far more convincing than anything to be heard on Back Where I Belong. This may sound like a small-scale effort on paper, especially considering the guests who had featured on Back Where I Belong. But if that's the case, then this is punching so far above its weight. It's almost unbelievable. And all right, for all of maybe the occasional rough edge here, maybe, yes, you could say, perhaps, yes, if only it had a Naomi or somebody, to work with. This could have perhaps gone somewhere else, been a little better. But these are really nuanced criticisms, and there's nothing, I think, where you can really point to and say, that didn't work. But this album is a really solid reminder that Tony Martin was far from simply being Black Sabbath's forgotten frontman. The songwriting in general is muscular, it's confident, it's steeped in the dark, but it's got a melodic tint to it, shall we say. Something which I think, was a trademark of his time in Sabbath, at least in his initial tenure with the band. Yes, the Sabbath references are there, one can't help but notice them, obviously, given his past with the band. But even if that was not the case, this is a very, very good, in place of dark, traditional metal album. In terms of his voice, and I was not that enthusiastic about his vocal performance on Back Where I Belong, this does not go back quite, I will say, to those, operatic wails that was such a feature of Headless Cross and Tear. But this is a very, very, very strong vocal performance, far superior to Back Where I Belong. It's more, perhaps, reflective of his work on Cross Purposes and Eternal Idol. He doesn't stretch out, although he stretches out here more than he did perhaps there, but again, it's not to the extent he did on Headless Cross and Tear. But no, there's very, very strong vocal performance. There's warmth, there's maturity, there's aggression, there's grit. And he finds the right vocal for the song on every occasion. It's really, you have to say, that somebody who's very comfortable with what he's doing here. And he's doing it damn well. If you are a fan of Tony Martin era Black Sabbath, this is an essential purchase. It really is. If you're a fan of classic heavy metal in general, I would say this is an essential purchase. I said I find it superior to a lot. So into some of his last two Sabbath efforts and some of the other releases going on around the Sabbath camp, at the time. But I would again go further. I think this is vastly superior to many of the so-called classic-sounding heavy metal bands and what they were producing at the time, including some pretty big names. And it deserved far more recognition than it received. And obviously, there are going to be lots of reasons for that. But I think there was a slight lack of identity with Tony Martin. People knew him from Black Sabbath. Well, people had forgotten Back Where I Belong, I think. But again, between Sabbath and this release, he had been doing work with and for others. He didn't have that identity, shall we say, that perhaps is required. That when you release something under your own name, it just has more broader appeal. Nevertheless, he did get out on the road with this. Did a modest European tour. Look it up, Tony Martin Live, 2005, 2006. There's plenty of stuff on YouTube. The set he did was very Sabbath-focused, and obviously there are perfectly understandable reasons for that. But watching them live and listening to this record, it does make one wonder what he may have achieved that had he, one, had a more stable band around him, and two, had he produced more records of this quality since he left Black Sabbath. One thinks there's a niche out there, not a niche, so that's too patronizing. There was a place for him in the market there. You can't deny the quality of this. But it didn't happen. And he went back to his collaborations, his session work, and it would be almost another 15 years before we hear from again in his solo capacity. So let's give him one thing, if nothing else. He is at least consistent. Anyway, we'll have to wait till next time to discover what I think about his, to date at least, final solo release. Okay, those are my thoughts. Please let me know what you think. Please feel free to comment, to like, to share, to subscribe, and all those good things. And until next time, I thank you for your indulgence. I wish you well, and Maçhonquèrre.